Welcome. My name is Aubrey Ruby, and I'm a senior fellow at the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this critical discussion today as we look forward to COP28 in the UAE. That's just starting in a couple weeks' time, and having a conversation today about African solutions at COP and how to advance sustainable development. And that's an issue that's near and dear to our heart at the Africa Center, because we launched over a year and a half ago a working group on climate finance, because we realized that Africa has 16% of the world's population. It has 25% of the world's remaining rainforests, and yet attracts only 3% of global climate finance. So today we're talking with leaders who will be in Dubai, but who've also spent time in their careers looking for the nexus of where interests align between developed countries, developing countries, and where African innovations can be core to that. So we're going to start our event today with a keynote conversation with Jennifer Serra she is the Director for Climate Change at the World Bank, and she'll give an outlook on what we can expect, and particularly coming out of Nairobi Declaration that we saw, where African leaders came together. And so looking at what we've achieved this year and the way forward. Jennifer, please, welcome.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Aubrey, for the kind introduction. It's actually a delight to be here to speak about Africa. I actually started my career in Africa. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Liberia in the 1980s. So coming back full circle, what I wanted to talk about today is really highlight what you said, the three main points. One, as you mentioned, Africa's role at COP, Africa's the Climate Summit in Nairobi. The second one is COP itself, what is COP, and third, what the World Bank will bring to COP. And as you mentioned, Aubrey, not only does Africa only not receive 3%, less than 3% of climate finance, Africa is responsible for less than 3% of global emissions, and we all know this. And we know that climate challenge is very deeply unjust. Especially the African countries have done the least amount to cause the climate crisis, but are the most impacted. Example, Malawi has the lowest per capita emissions globally, and Rwanda contributes 0.003% to global emissions. So this is just examples, and yet these are countries across the continent who are severely impacted by climate impacts, floods and droughts. We've seen this temperature increases. And we're seeing also that across the globe, the intensity of climate events are worsening. And that's significantly going to impact development gains and poverty reduction. However, it's not all doom and gloom, and I think if we look back at Nairobi and the Africa Climate Summit, at the Africa Climate Summit, we really see where Africa's taken on the role, the leadership protagonism, not being a victim, but how can they act with urgency. And I think that's really very, very exciting. African leaders rightly called on the global community, first of all, to act with urgency to reduce emissions in line with the Paris Agreement, to honor past and current commitments, including the $100 billion of climate finance, and also to uphold commitments to a fair and accelerated process of phasing out fossil fuels and providing targeted support to the poorest and most vulnerable, including to deliver on the Loss and Damage Fund. At the same time, African leaders offered 23 specific clauses in the Africa Climate Summit statement that offered where Africa's going to lead in this agenda. This includes issues such as propelling Africa's economic growth and job creation in a manner that reflects their commitments to the Paris agreements. It's about focusing on economic development that builds on a climate-positive growth trajectory. It talks about promoting clean cooking technologies, accelerating renewable energy, strengthening actions to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, deforestation, desertification, leadership about continental collaboration, advancing green industrialization, redoubling efforts in agriculture yields, investing in water, in drought resilience, and strengthening early warning systems. So it goes on, and I think the point really is here that Africa is proposing a comprehensive approach to how it wants to lead on finding climate solutions, also discussing their own, increasing their national determined contributions and long-term strategies as a framework for moving together. And also, finally, that Africa wants to work with effective partnerships within and across Africa, but also with other regions, so as a global player. So I think the context there of Africa's protagonism was well stated in the Africa Climate Summit. And this is a strong position to come into COP. And so let's remember what COP is about. It's a conference of parties. It's a conference of parties, of countries coming together to negotiate and to agree. For us, the World Bank, we're an observer to the process, and we are there just to support the country negotiations and support with the means of implementation. So the three major areas of this negotiations and agreement is, the first of all, is how do we keep the 1.5 degree target alive? And this is really critical because we're way off track, and every fraction of a degree will impact lives and livelihoods. So it's going to be very, very important to be able to step up on renewables, deliver energy access to the 600 million people who don't have it, as we get out of transition out of fossil fuels. And we also address the hard-to-abate sectors, and especially the really potent gases such as methane. And of course, the second is stepping up on adaptation. We're hearing lots and lots of calls from around the world, and especially Africa. How do we step up adaptation efforts and finance? And I think what's important here is we don't just look at adaptation as an add-on. Adaptation is just smart, resilient development. So we deliver adaptation as we deliver clean air, clean energy, all kinds of development, getting kids to school, education, health. And I think that's what's important, is that we look at adaptation, again, as resilient development, as an integrated package of delivering the sustainable development goals in a climate-informed way. It does require a huge step up in financing. It does involve the need to really zero in and target on the most vulnerable. And finally, as I mentioned, the third part of COP is the means of implementation, and that's really where the World Bank comes in. It talks about capacity building, policy, finance. This year, of course, the topic will also include the new Loss and Damage Fund. I think the big picture takeaway here is to keep in mind there's no single government, there's no single agency that can do this alone, and this is about working together. And finally, this brings me to the role of the World Bank. Not only are we the biggest lender of climate finance to developing countries, and not just lender, but also we provided huge amounts of grants through our IDA. The World Bank delivered close to $39 billion in climate finance last year. But it's not so important for us at the World Bank to show up at COP. It's not our stage. It's an opportunity for us to showcase the work we're doing with countries and partners and what they're doing and how we can support them through knowledge, financing, and policy support, and also how we can help crowd in private investment. So for the COP, specifically, the 5 priority areas for Africa that we see we can support and be addressed. One is to expand access to clean, affordable, and reliable energy to facilitate a just energy transition. The second one is boosting climate-smart agriculture and supporting supply and value chains. The third is the issue of improving connectivity and reducing the vulnerability of Africa's transport network. The fourth is prioritizing Africa's participation in climate finance and in all forms of carbon markets, the compliance markets, Article 6, as well as the voluntary carbon markets, in a way that ensures high integrity credits and also clear benefit sharing and pass-through mechanisms to communities who generate and sustain the credits. And finally, the fifth point is ensuring solutions are people-centered, especially we look at social safety nets and strategies to address disaster risk management. So these are the areas that we at the World Bank are really supporting Africa. They come out of the Africa's priorities from the Africa Climate Summit. And particularly the importance of the theme today is about innovative ways to finance climate action. And how do we come together with African-led solutions, country-level solutions that crowd in domestic, concessional, and private finance around coherent packages. So let me end there and just again highlight the importance of why we need to work in partnership and how climate finance has to come from multiple sources to maximize impact on the ground. We need to do it around very coherent and sound policies as well to frame sustainable investment programs. So I look forward to listening to today's discussion on the different approaches and solutions on the way to COP, and we look forward to seeing you all in Dubai and hear what Africa will bring to the table. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for that kind of stage setting. I think it's an important moment for us to zoom in and use our location here in Washington to talk about the U.S. View of COP and where there are opportunities for collaboration. I'm joined here at the table with Joshua Volz, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe, Eurasia, Africa, and the Middle East. I think that's everything but Latin America at the U.S. Department of Energy. And Jake Levine, who's the Chief Climate Officer of the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. So welcome, gentlemen. I know, Joshua, you're on a tight schedule. It's that time of year. So we'll start with you. Just give us a sense of how the Department of Energy is thinking about COP. I think very much about the ambition level and this tension between ambitions and pragmatism. And we've seen incredible ambition with the Inflation Reduction Act and what that's meant for new technologies and particularly electric vehicles and things of that sort in this country that then relate to the opportunities in African countries around critical minerals, et cetera. So would love to get your outlook on all things Department of Energy going into COP.
Well, thank you, Aubrey, and really a big thank you to the Atlantic Council's Africa Center for hosting such an incredibly important and timely conversation. The Atlantic Council always does an incredible job of bringing together some of the best minds on some of these issues, really at critical periods of time. So thank you for that. Look, first and foremost, COP is like anything else in the world. It's what you make of it. Yeah. It's a platform. And what we hope to do there is to really amplify a lot of the work that we are doing and figure out concrete ways to move forward to actually implement a lot of that ambition that you talked about. And at the beginning of your comments this morning, you talked about development and sustainability. And those are the two kind of key underpinning themes that we at the Department of Energy are working on. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot drive towards carbon neutrality and net zero without taking into account the need to continue to develop economies and to move forward with increasing the share of economic wealth and opportunity that exists.
Yeah, that's why the Africans always talk about a dual imperative, right? They
Exactly.
feel like in developed countries, you've already grown in a carbon-intensive way, delivering prosperity at least across populations. But when you have 600 million Africans who don't have access to regular electricity or reliable electricity, then they have to both develop and do it in a green way. So that dual imperative is hard to navigate.
Exactly right. It's a parallel movement, not a sequential movement.
And it brings the question, too, of fossil fuels and phasing out fossil fuels, which is a big discussion at COP. And I just came from the Africa Investment Forum in Marrakesh. And if you hear African leaders, development finance in particular, they will say, listen, how are we going to have sustainable power if we can't develop our natural gas? And so this tension exists around that because they feel that there's no solution to baseload power in any meaningful way without fossil fuels. And that discussion and that tension is one that I think we'll have to navigate.
Indeed. Well, look, I think we have to be very clear-eyed about where our African partners are and the need to, again, as I said, move forward in parallel, not in sequence. It's clear that fossil fuels are going to play, and specifically natural gas, are going to play an important role for the foreseeable future in the energy transition, and incredibly important for both economic development domestically, but also for baseload power. Simultaneously, we're really, from a Department of Energy perspective, moving forward with a lot of the opportunities that civil nuclear technology provides. And recently, we just had a Pan-African conference held in Accra, Ghana, to highlight the opportunities in civil nuclear technology and really explore some of the partnership opportunities on the continent. And we've got a lot of interest in that space, especially when we're talking about small modular reactors and the ability to deploy that technology quicker and more efficiently and at a lower cost than the larger traditional build options.
And if we as the U.S. don't help partners do that, others will. I was just recently in Bangladesh, and they have just inaugurated a nuclear facility that was invested in and supported by the Russians, for example. So I do think there's that interest, but there is still that tension where people are like, well, we haven't even ended flaring of natural gas and captured the natural gas. Now we're talking about nuclear, and that seems a little far-fetched. But I think something that's very real right now, which kind of touches on exactly what I said about the IRA and electric vehicles in the US, is critical minerals and what that can mean for a green future globally, but Africa's role in those value chains. How are you thinking about that?
Well, we all know there's a tremendous amount of resource capacity on the continent. And those resources have been accessed for quite a long time, but not in a way that has pulled African economies up the value chain and created those economic opportunities that those resources provide. We need to move to a different model of cooperation on the continent, and that's something I know that my colleague Jake is going to talk about. But we have to create opportunities for Africans to increase the value add of those resources, and not just about the extraction and the processing of those resources, but also the human capital that comes along with that. The energy transition is not going to be able to take place unless we retrain massive amounts of people and create the intellectual and the human capital to support that transition. And so we're working across the entire spectrum, both how do we help our African partners, increase the value add of their resources, but also how do we grow the intellectual economy that is necessary for underpinning
and
those
ensure that it stays there, right?
That's right.
I just came back from Nigeria over the weekend, and Nigerians in the United States are the most educated diaspora group in the United States. Obviously, education is valued and attainment is there. The question is, are the opportunities for jobs in the space happening? Jake, I want to bring you in here because we know that there's a investment gap when it comes to investing in both mitigation and adaptation on the continent. Some say it's in the trillions. And then there's this backlog of commitments of $100 billion that Jennifer mentioned. How is the DFC mobilizing capital, not only your own, but from the private sector, to try to address some of these gaps and seize the opportunities?
Well, thanks, Aubrey. Thank you for the opportunity to join the conversation. I also just want to say thank you to the Ambassador Yad, for her leadership and for the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. As Josh said, who just left, but now the two of us will have a focused discussion.
Yes.
This is such a timely. I was so thrilled to have the opportunity to join you, because I think that the story of African leadership on this issue and the presence of so many of those leaders in Dubai coming up just in the next couple of weeks is so important, and it's a story that isn't being told or understood. And so I just am honored to have the chance to participate with you. You mentioned DFC. The whole thesis of DFC is that as the world faces a whole host of problems, poverty, healthcare, digital infrastructure, climate, that there is not enough capacity in any government or any group of governments to solve these problems on their own. At the same time, there's not enough capacity in the private sector. There needs to be a bridge.
Right.
And that's why DFC was created a few years ago, to be that bridge, to help crowd in and catalyze private sector investment into all of these critical areas. I think we're starting to see tremendous traction already. I was just looking, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves in terms of some of the good news that we're going to bring to Dubai, but I was looking, for example, at our FY23 numbers, where DFC set another record for climate finance as part of its total. Another multi-billion-dollar year, the second in a row. In our first year, we were about $450 million. Last year, 2.4. This year, another growth on top of that. 33% of that is in Africa. So that is a marked departure from the 3% that I think you mentioned in your remarks, from the enormous gap that we've recognized that there is, and it reflects the focus that we have on catalyzing investments in these key regions.
Can you give us an example of a project that you've been excited about recently that kind of make those numbers real?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it was Sarah who mentioned some of the impacts being felt in Malawi. And she reminded me of a project that I'm excited to have the chance to go visit, I think in January. This is the first of its kind utility scale solar plus storage project on the continent. DFC invested $25 million, particularly for the storage component of this project. Now, in an economy that is susceptible to climate impacts, for example, knocking out, I think, something close to 50% of the grid's electric generating capacity last year.
Yeah.
This project is providing reliable baseload, clean and firm energy resources. It's also, to Josh's point earlier, providing jobs, opportunities for local community development and investment in a particularly remote region of the country.
Sure.
And we see it as a project that will attract investment from businesses. Mm-hmm. So when you take a look at the Malawi grid, you maybe see the beginnings of something that we would like to replicate, but also that we've seen, for example, to the north in Kenya, where DFC has a major wind power generating asset, the Kapeto project, and a major geothermal generating asset, an ore power project, that is now feeding into what is a 93% clean energy grid that in turn is attracting investment from businesses who are looking to reduce their Scope 2 emissions and reduce their carbon footprint towards net zero. That allowed us this year to commit to, I think I have a note here, $10 million for one of the electric motorcycle companies that we're now investing in Nairobi. This is just one, by the way. I mean, there's a proliferation of innovation happening in this space now in Kenya as a result of the infrastructure that has been in place for several years to provide zero carbon electricity. So I think you can start imagining these virtuous cycles of infrastructure investments that sort of beget additional investment, entrepreneurship, innovation, and that's the type of cycle that we want to recreate. Malawi and Kenya are a far cry from some of what's happening, say, in other parts of the continent that haven't yet broken through, and that's the area that we want to start focusing on.
Sure, I'd be remiss. I mean, you mentioned infrastructure. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Lobito corridor.
Yeah.
And it's the U.S.'s, I think, biggest foray into, let's say, hard infrastructure that China has been dominating, I think, over the last 15 years. And it's got all elements to it, and I think you see climate as integrated throughout DFC investments. So say a little bit about where DFC is on that large project.
So I'm glad you raised it. I actually had the opportunity to visit with some of the project parties just a few weeks ago in Angola and then also in DRC. Mm-hmm. DFC has been actively diligencing the rail component of this project, the Lobito Atlantic Rail Corridor, which, as you may know, is actually a historically active rail corridor that has fallen into disrepair and is now in a decrepit and non-functional state. We're also interested in and exploring opportunities to support the container port in Lobito, which will be critical for getting exports out to the West. Now, if you speak with a business in Zambia, for example, that's doing exports out of DRC, and you ask, what is it like to operate across this border?
Move a container, everything moves by truck.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
There are people sitting in a 150-kilometer line for 3 weeks, inching forward to get their products out via Mombasa, Durban, Dar, all to the east or to the south. And meanwhile, we've got this enormous opportunity to go west.
With their engines idling often.
Engines idling, diesel fuel, air pollution. So this rail actually does offer an opportunity to decarbonize, but it also is critical for getting the millions of tons of hopefully refined critical mineral product, not just concentrate that would repeat the same cycle of extraction and export without any local beneficiation or local value add in the.
And I think it's that kind of nuance that our African partners are looking to see, right? A nuance that is recognizing the interplay between infrastructure and green growth. That nuance that recognizes that large investments need to have all these elements in them to make them sustainable, and that long time adding value to the critical minerals that will go through that corridor means the economic development and jobs that can make so many of the commitments sustainable. And so I think it's that kind of nuanced partnership that they're looking for, and I'm sure that that's how you're thinking in going into COP.
Well, I think you're right. I think that there is a broad recognition in a country like Congo, for example, that this cycle of extraction can no longer be sustainable. It can't be abided any longer because it has not produced investments in education,
right,
in healthcare, in infrastructure, in roads. The businesses that are contending with a lack of connectivity, whether it's transport or telecommunications, these are the sort of few and far between. We want to crowd in your run-of-the-mill processing, refining business that is expecting a certain level of infrastructure and basic services to do their work. And I think that the Congolese that we've met with, they are ready to move on from a model that has been so extractive.
Yeah.
They want to find opportunities to invest locally. It goes back to the energy conversation that we were talking about as well, because there is a recognition that these minerals that are sitting underneath the earth, they represent a uniquely decarbonized vision of the future. Look at a electric vehicle rolling off an assembly line in Shanghai today. That vehicle is produced with an enormous amount of fossil fuels,
right,
both the materials that go into it and the production of the vehicle itself. Now, to go back to Congo, this is a vision that has not yet come to fruition, but imagine rehabilitating the Inga Dam turbines, putting 30, 40 gigawatts of clean baseload electricity back on the grid, servicing that to the south,
yep,
to Angola, connecting that into the South Africa power pool, where there's huge demand for clean electricity, servicing that to the east, to the mining and processing and refining operations that can then market that onto a global stage because they know that there is demand for a green a product that is not being delivered in the market. These are the kinds of opportunities that we've seen getting, I think Kenya is sort of the exemplar,
yeah,
of having recognized this opportunity and taken advantage of it in so many ways. We want to facilitate similar growth trajectories in countries like Congo,
yep,
to achieve the same
And again,
gains.
it's that nuanced discussion there that recognizes that the way things are done right now in formal supply chains, the truckers that are going across, if you look at Dangote's trucks across West Africa, it's the same. They're going all the way. He has 13,000 of them. That these supply chains and way goods are moved today is dirty in many ways. And so investing in solutions that may be considered like a refinery could be actually net carbon savings because of the way the fuel moves around the world today. So it's those nuances that I think we want to bring out when we think of an Africa-centered view and perspective going into COP. And it's with that we'll transition to our panel discussion here today. I want to thank you, Jake, for joining. I will see you in Dubai, and eager to hear a lot more on those announcements you'll make as DFC does more in the space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aubrey. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, everyone, for staying with us. We're moving now to a discussion more direct from the continent to hear what is going on in terms of planning and coming together from the African perspective. And I'm joined by three guests here. Jacqueline Masitwa, who's joining, she's a fellow here at the Africa Center, and she's joining us virtually today. Terza Tippin-Poe, who's a senior fellow at the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council, and Jean-Paul Adam, who's the Director for Technology, Climate Change, and Natural Resource Management at UNECA. And many of you know.
Sorry, I'm now with the Office of the Secretary General.
Aha, Office of the Secretary. I can't even keep up.
Special
I can't even keep up with your career on how it's growing and evolving, Jean-Paul. So maybe Jean-Paul, we'll start with you in that new role, and
Yes.
please tell us what it's looking like to you from the kind of preparations for COP on the African side.
Well, I think the narrative is a strong one coming from the Africa Climate Summit, which is one of opportunity, not just of victimhood. And I think that's an extremely important moment because it is a difficult time on the continent. There have been unconstitutional changes of government, and the external impact of global issues have a bigger disrupting effect.
Yeah.
The economy generally in Africa has not recovered as robustly as the rest of the world following the COVID-19 pandemic. The inflation,
And the war in Ukraine, yeah.
The war in Ukraine, inflation, energy prices have also had a bigger impact. But African countries are saying, well, climate resilient growth actually allows Africa to tap into its comparative advantage. This is an area where the cost of renewables in Africa, believe it or not, the cost of generation is actually cheaper than a lot of the rest of the world. So, and the requirement in terms of access, so 600 million people still don't have access. So if you focus on the access part, which the reality of where we are in terms of technology does mean that there will be increased fossil fuel investment as well for base generation. But overall, if we focus on the renewables, then you can have a lower cost of energy, which then leads to a more competitive economy and allowing the full benefit of the implementation of the African Free Trade Area to take into effect.
And perhaps even energy exports, like we've seen
Correct.
in
Like
North
for
Africa.
example, around green hydrogen, there's a lot of opportunity that is emerging on that side. But I think so there's the export element of things like green hydrogen. There's the export as well of critical minerals, which we heard about, and being more involved in the value addition, but also the transformative effect of simply connecting this 600 million people. So the connecting this 600 million people will be one of the biggest transformative economic actions, not only for Africa, for the world. Because when people are connected to energy grids, they are better able to do their own small business, they're able to be more productive, they usually have better educational outcomes. It's one of the fastest accelerators of development that you can see, and that's good for the global economy, not just for the African economy.
And no doubt, I just came, as I said, I was in Nigeria twice over the last 2 weeks. You know, it's a country of 60 million generators, diesel generators. And I think if there was one thing you could do to supercharge the economy, it would be, you know, reliable electricity in Nigeria that wasn't dependent on diesel, particularly now that fuel prices have gone up. So that inflation is hitting everyone. So couldn't agree more on the need to supercharge growth through energy. Jean-Paul, staying with you, to say a little bit about how African countries are preparing, the negotiations, the negotiators. There's momentum out of the Nairobi Declaration. What do you expect to see? I know Zambia is playing a big role, and I know the Kenyan President Ruto has seen himself as a climate president now. What do you expect to see on the negotiation side?
Well, firstly, the finance will be at the top of the agenda. And there's going to be a big push from African countries to address the gaps in terms of financing. And there is an imperative to deal with the trust that is associated with the COP process. The fact that the 100 billion, which was promised, has not been delivered is a huge trust gap in terms of these global processes. So there is an expectation that we move beyond the promises and that there are significant funds that are provided in that aspect. Related to that, there's also the moral aspect of loss and damage, but we're going in the right direction. The pre-COP meetings have agreed certain principles or proposed certain principles on how this loss and damage fund will operate. It's a step in the right direction. It's still going to be a difficult discussion, but that's an important aspect for Africa. And then in terms of finance, there's also the big element of how to get the private sector involved. Africa is the region that has the least participation of private sector in its climate finance.
Yeah.
Only 14% of climate finance in Africa comes from the private sector. There's a big dependence on development aid and partners.
Sure.
Compare that with other regions. The next lowest region is Southeast Asia, and they have in excess of 30% of participation of the private sector. So you can see the huge gap on Africa. And all of these areas that we've heard about around critical minerals, around energy investment, and even if we're going to develop the carbon credits, all of this depends on an environment which will allow the private sector to invest. And I think a lot of the push from President Ruto and from others will be to say, we are not actually coming with a begging bowl. We are saying there is an opportunity for climate resilient growth in Africa, which will actually be faster than if we stay on the extractive model and focused on fossil fuels, which are hugely variable because of global processes.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit easier for Kenya that is got
Correct.
geothermal and than some of the countries that are well endowed on the fossil fuel side. But Jacqueline, want to come to you. Jean-Paul just talked about the need to be catalytic in terms of bringing in private sector finance. What do you think are some of the obstacles? And then how can we leverage the money that's coming in from the donors today? I know you spend some time advising USAID. To unlock that private sector capital?
Thanks so much, Aubrey. Great to be here today. I think just jumping on Jean-Paul's point of narrative, I think it's really important to start there, because what we're also seeing with Africa positioning itself as really participating in solutions to climate change is also capital saying, show us the opportunities. And so we're seeing different countries really come up with better and more bankable pipelines, saying, you've always challenged us to say there are no bankable projects, whereas now you're starting to kind of get a few more. You're also seeing development finance institutions, accelerators on the continent, also engaging more in project prep and really bringing to the fore of the range of climate projects that might be available for private sector engagement. What I'm hearing a lot from the private sector, especially globally, is it's still too risky. So even though we're making a little bit of progress on the narrative of Africa as being part of climate solutions, I still think that there is some work to be done on telling a narrative of Africa's risk in a more realistic and balanced way. There's risk everywhere around the world. And so it's really just kind of understanding African risk and how best to manage it. Now,
and that actually reminds me of the Moody's study that was done looking at energy projects in particular and default rate on those projects, and found that North America's default rate was 3 times the African default rate, so 9% versus 3%. And maybe it's because the projects that do get done in African markets are very well structured and very risk mitigated with all the partners, and we just need to increase the number that get there. But it is that misperception of risk, Jacqueline, that you're speaking about that really prevents a lot of folks, and maybe different size of projects as well. That's something I see all the time when I talk to large institutional investors. They want to put large investments to work, large checks to work, but the opportunity that we're seeing are smaller. It might be a mini grid somewhere, and then you need 10 to 20 million and not 400 million. So how do you bridge that, Jacqueline?
I think that's where there's an exciting opportunity for a lot of the accelerators that are coming up across the continent, as well as the DFI space, so development finance institutions, as well as donors. And you're starting to see an interesting engagement that's resulting in blended finance structures that are targeting smaller projects but are also trying to de-risk larger projects that are trying to attract large pools of capital. But I think there's still some work to be done on the cost of finance. It is still more expensive for African projects to attract money. And then there's a currency issue that I'm happy was brought up a lot during the conversations, not only at the Africa Climate Summit, but also in Paris. And how do we shift to the use of more local currency within transactions rather than hard currency? But from a donor perspective, besides blended models, which I think we will continue to see more of, I think you'll also start to see the investment in more pilots in areas that typically, quote unquote, haven't been bankable, such as adaptation. You know, how do we work on different solutions in water, for instance, or climate smart ag that are really able to scale up, but really starting to understand this model from different parts of the continent and how small pools of grant capital can come in and over time learn different places, the opportunities, and grow them. But I think the last part that's really exciting on a finance side is we're starting to see different types of investors come into the continent. So it's not the typical large global private equity firms or even African financial institutions. We are seeing more money, for instance, from the Gulf coming in and really looking for climate projects and trying to understand how to play within that space.
Yeah, that reminds me of the 4.5 billion that was announced by the UAE. And I think this COP will have other similar announcements. The question is then, of course, just because people pledge and put money doesn't mean it flows to the actual projects. So it kind of brings back the same questions that you have. Terza, I want to bring you into the conversation here. I mean, you're a senior fellow at the Global Energy Center. And where have you seen this work in other parts of the world? Are there countries or regions? I know you have a unique personal history as well and background. And so just understanding what we can learn from other regions is valuable here.
Yeah, thanks, Aubrey. I just want to jump off of what Jacqueline was saying about adaptation. So just to give a little context and history, and I think Jean-Paul might have something to say about this also. Let's go back in history to Paris, COP28. As an indigenous person, my people are from the U.S. Arctic, Inupiaq. This is Inuit country. We were very interested in 2015, that December, November, December, in bringing to the forward voices at that COP that weren't being heard, as was the island nations.
Correct, the small island nations.
And we did, I think the island nations got a line or two in that agreement. Unfortunately, indigenous people were once again overlooked. We did take note of that. Why is that centered on adaptation? It was in 2015 that we showed up, we being a larger group of indigenous people, actually the largest that had ever come to a COP, and said, it's happening now. It's not in the future. It's been happening in our region for decades. And we're here to do two things. And this is where I think Africa really, we can join with them in this call for a focus on adaptation, is we need to be thinking about how do we deal with what's happening now. We already have dramatic climate events, have been having them. This does not mean we put aside mitigation and the goal for 1.5, because obviously, logically, to avoid future you know, I'm going to state the obvious here, but I think we can hold both in our heads as it pertains to financing. And we just started to touch on this, and I think as we zero down on these commitments, hopefully, that are going to be made, including the one already from the UAE, is how are those commitments tied to goals? What are the metrics for using that money for climate? When you say climate finance, how is that applied? And I'm going to get to my second point, which is very relevant to this, which is when we talk about hearing people's voices in the conversation, that means that we need to problematize correctly, or what Jacqueline was saying, project prep is another way to put it. So we don't know what we don't know. And you having traveled a lot in Africa, and I'm from the US Arctic, I think what we share in those areas is the UFO syndrome. People coming in, assuming there's a solution, and usually a one-size-fits-all, that will apply to the entire region, to all peoples, to all communities. So that is a recipe for disaster. That is not.
That's why I was trying to get at that kind of nuanced thinking when we were talking with Jake and Joshua, because, you know, if you don't recognize that, like today, you know, petrol is put on in the port of Mombasa and driven by truck all the way to Congo, to Eastern Congo, and to think that that's okay, right? You know, that there's other kinds of investments that offset, even if those investments are not green by definition, they might be greener than what's going on today. And we need those nuanced discussions to happen. Otherwise, you're going to have a narrow view of climate finance, and African countries risk missing out again on large investments unless we kind of figure out and those that have capital can understand these nuances.
Yes. Is it really a solution if the people most deeply impacted are not in the room when you make it? I mean, it's that foundational, I think. And I think I'm very encouraged, and I want to say thank you for having me in this conversation. I'm very encouraged by already what I'm hearing from the Nairobi Agreement, being very clear around the fact that African voices need to be in the room. Ambassador Yad emphasized that in previous conversations. She was very clear. Her two biggest concerns, and I'm just going to steal her points because we share them in other parts of the world, in the US Arctic in particular, which is one, that solutions will be developed without us and our input, and two, that conservation goals, that we don't repeat the legacies of colonialism through conservation. That countries, there are 55 countries in Africa, aren't sacrificed, and people aren't sacrificed for the conservation goals. Now, that may be considered on the periphery of climate finance, but actually it's at the beating heart if we're talking about carbon markets.
Sure.
Are we going to turn people's lands that they've occupied since forever, millennium, into carbon credits? And we do, unless we do this right, we do run the danger of doing just that.
And I think, Teresa, you bring up a very important point, that one that we're working on at the Atlantic Council here, about how do we think about the international financing architecture and the Bretton Woods system and reforms that need to take place. I mean, the Biden administration has expressed commitments to seeing reforms within the large Bretton Woods institutions. But, you know, Jean-Paul, from where you sit today, how do we make sure that that international financing architecture is more suited to the needs of indigenous communities and African nations?
I think one of the first things is to understand the current challenges. So, for example, climate resilient growth is more effective for different reasons. Partly because you're building against future risks, so the investment will actually, over time, be more resilient. But also, again, in many of these developing regions, and particularly in Africa, it makes more sense in any case. You're getting a better return on investment.
Yeah, and you might be able to leapfrog,
and you'll be able to leapfrog. So there's many good reasons to do it. But you have to recognize that this type of investment requires front loading. So it requires a large amount of capital now. And the current global environment is not adapted. We have high interest rates. So and where there are multiple wars happening, which are diverting resources away from the kind of large-scale investment that needs to happen. So there has to be an understanding. There's no cheap way to do this, all right? There is no cheap way to do it. However, the return, if you do it now, the return on investment will be global. It will not be featured in just one region. It will actually lead to better resilience more broadly. The other aspect, I would say, there are some simple things which require political will and not necessarily much additional finance. So, for example, the reallocation of special drawing rights. So this is capital that already exists, that's already there, And it means that essentially it's a kind of reserve capital, and it just means
This is
aligning
within the
it-
World Bank
It's
group.
within the World Bank
So
and
for
the
our
IMF
viewers who
group.
may not be familiar with
Correct,
special
yes.
drawing rights.
So special drawing rights essentially are allocated on the basis of your of the country's participation in those institutions. So obviously richer countries have more, but need them less.
Yeah, correct.
So the idea is those countries that need them less can reallocate them, and not free of charge. They will be repaid. So they're not going to lose that money.
Almost a secondaries market.
And they reallocate it to institutions in the region, such as the African Development Bank, that can invest that capital for this front loading, for this upfront investment that is required. That is something which doesn't cost a lot of money. For taxpayers, it's actually neutral in the immediate. It's just a question of the return on the capital over a period of time. But these countries that do that will actually get their money back over a period of time.
And I want to bring in Jacqueline here on the role of African DFIs. We at the Africa Center have worked closely with Africa Finance Corporation, AFC. We've worked with the African Investment Forum at AFDB. We've worked with Trade and Development Bank and DBSA, Development Bank of Southern Africa. They've all been part of our efforts on inclusive climate financing. And they're going to play a bigger role in this kind of story because they have credit ratings, because they're multinational entities that are much higher than the one governments. And so, Jacqueline, how do you think they could be platforms for some of this global capital?
One, I mean, I think there are several ways, and partnership is a good start. I think AFDB has done a great job, definitely within the past year, of zeroing in on some specific climate solutions that require larger partnerships. So whether that is the Green Bank Initiative, where they've managed to bring in a number of both African but also global partners to the table, whether it's thinking about the nexus of gender and climate. And so I think it would be great to see more African DFIs engaging in wider partnerships. Two, I think going back to the point of being at the table, I think we see AFDB at global fora. I think it would be great to see more of the other DFIs equally really representing the constituencies that they're in. And going back to the issue of nuance, really being able to, for Trade and Development Bank, for instance, to say, we cover a couple of island states, and these are the problems that they're experiencing. This is what we would like from global partnerships. I think another aspect is, once again, really playing a bigger role in jumpstarting African private sector to do more. Part of it is an education aspect. How do you sufficiently educate local financial institutions about how to green their portfolios and how to work with them so they can on-lend to a woman who would like to put a solar panel on her house, to how can they really create greater syndicates to fund larger power projects, for instance. So I think some innovation there should definitely take place. But I think one thing that has been great to watch over the course of the past decade, as you mentioned, is African DFIs have seen an improvement in their own credit ratings, which I think is a testament to the fact that we can, when put in different ways, really attract greater capital to the continent, manage it well, and come up with not only impactful climate solutions, but also impactful social solutions. I think two last points on this one is, I think there's a really important role that the Green Climate Fund has to play. And it would also be great to see, AFDB, DBSA are all accredited entities, but really how can we make sure that African institutions are really pushing the GCF to get more money from the GCF that can be deployed locally, and also making sure that it goes to countries that are not only climate vulnerable, but also fragile on a political scale. How can we start to see more climate finance, for instance, go to Somalia, so that as it's on the one hand managing al-Shabaab, is equally able to start to rebuild resilient infrastructure in the same way. So once again, I think it's engagement at the right levels globally, ensuring there's greater partnership and really pushing for greater private sector partnership within the African context itself.
Yeah, I want to take a couple questions from our audience there. If you have questions, we're using the Ask AC function here. And I think part of they come out of the discussion we had with Jake and Joshua about new technologies that can help maybe African countries leapfrog. And so what can be done on nuclear in Africa is one of our questions. Sometimes I think that there's maybe an ambition gap. I come across the continent, I mentioned nuclear, they're like, wow, that seems like a bridge too far. But green hydrogen and nuclear are really increasingly on the table. So Jean-Paul, Terza, what do you think about these new technologies?
I think that, if I can start,
Yeah.
maybe, that any technology that improves access is a step in the right direction. But yes, I do think there has to be an assessment which is done at country level to what degree is this adaptable to our circumstance. There may be one or two. I don't think nuclear will be a big solution for the majority of African countries.
Maybe South Africa.
But it might be for one or two, some which already have some policy frameworks that are going down those lines. But I think the focus must always be on access. How do we get to this 100% access? Because of the multiplier effect that further has. And on the conversation, for example, about green hydrogen, I think it's very encouraging and it's very positive, but we should not just fall into the trap of just the same scenario where we extract something for export. Green hydrogen is going to be very valuable as long as it links in as well with a internal strategy for how
and
this
value
contributes.
chain and how you can use it.
And the value chain in terms of how this links in with something more substantial. And to link that to the critical minerals conversation, so in my previous role when I was at the Economic Commission of Africa, we did a study which showed that the cost of just doing the battery precursor, which is a part of the battery technology, just doing that in a country like the DRC would cost 50% less than currently. Most of them are done in China. It would cost 50% less, and it would be 50% less emissions. So if we're really looking at the future opportunities around this, it's actually about building that value chain where the resources are. And if we take cobalt, for example, 70% of the world's supply is actually in one country, in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Then when you look at where it's refined and processed.
And it's refined around the world, but mostly in Asia and in China and places like that. So I think that and to deal with that, and if we go back to the point about the energy aspect, is we do need to support African countries in terms of their energy planning. And there are a number of countries that have done this extremely well.
And that could be tech transfer too, right?
Technology transfer, linking this with their goals on access first, and if you go on the least cost option, if you focus on access first, automatically you will actually be leaning towards mostly renewables. There'll be exceptions for countries because there's not a one size fits all. But focusing on domestic capacity for achieving those goals of access, and then linking that to sustainable industrialization and value chains. And to go to Jacqueline's point of where are the projects, I think the question of pipeline is very important, but the finance and the source of finance is as important. It has to happen at the same time, because sometimes it's the chicken and the egg.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't have a pipeline because there's no available
And then how
form
can the
of finance.
sponsor pay for
Correct.
out of their own pocket to develop a project for 4 years without any sponsor?
And the best projects, the ones that work, and we've heard some examples, involve the private sector from day one. So even if there might be a strong governmental aspect or even a aid or development finance component, if you're already looking at who are going to be the clients going forward in terms of the private sector, where the private sector can co-invest, you'll have a much more successful project.
Terza, thoughts?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Jean-Paul's comments on access and this idea of public-private partnerships that has been so successful in other parts of the world, especially places that have critical infrastructure needs like energy. That would, in my case, a lot of experience in Canada and in the U.S. Arctic, where, in rural Canada, in the northern parts, private-public partnerships made access to energy and infrastructure happen. And as it did to some degree in the U.S. Arctic. But this, I want to dial it back just for a moment on the historical sort of context in Africa of extraction. I know we have to race ahead to solve a lot of problems. Some acknowledgement of that colonial extractive model, which still continues today, needs to happen. And again, I'm probably stating something that most of the audience already knows. And it ties, how does that tie to, say, the question from the audience member about technology? So there's, I think, an underlying mood or sort of motivation for that question that isn't there a technological solution that we can come in with and resolve these issues? Take a big chunk out of them. And it, again, goes to what I think is, it has been from my region in the U.S. Arctic and more broadly with people who haven't had a voice at the table, I'm going to go back to that, is that imposition of a solution that's been proved elsewhere. And then coming into a region and saying this is going to work. And I'm going to keep coming back to that because of the unique situation of Africa having, thousands of years of this type of thinking. And so I'm going to, again, round back to the people most deeply impacted, which are the people of Africa, really probably have solutions. And it's this capacity building that Jacqueline was talking about that's going to get us there.
Yeah, and as we close our time together today, I'd love to get some thoughts on what both Jacqueline and Jean-Paul, what you want to see happen at this COP. One of our audience members has asked, did the Nairobi Declaration go far enough? And what the unique staging is in UAE and what that means, because they've often played a bridge role. And they're not necessarily global south, but not necessarily global north either. And can they really create a platform for collaboration that's more unique than other places? So, Jacqueline, why don't we start with you, and then we'll end with Jean-Paul.
Yeah, no, I did it go enough? I think it went enough in the sense that getting to agreement from multiple countries and constituencies takes time. And so having brought together multiple people, multiple groups, I think we got to an okay outcome. I think the question following any declaration is how do we push it from declaration to action? And so I think that's what we're going to see at COP. I think the big thing also around climate will be jobs. How do we make sure that this transition to the green economy really brings more African jobs? I think this issue of equity that Teresa was talking about will be high on the agenda. Something that I'm not seeing as much that I think is an interesting part of the conversation as we talk about critical minerals is really the current state of the mining sector, how to mine better, safer, cleaner. And ensure that there's benefit to the host communities where we are getting these materials from. The other point is really around circularity. How do we make sure that we are creating a circular economy starting from mine all the way to kind of production point? Because otherwise we will get to this point where we have a new problem on our hands of lots of solar panels and other technologies that are on the continent no longer functioning and kind of dumped. So how do we avoid an e-waste situation on the continent? So I think that issue of circularity is important and hopefully it will come up. But I think it's really just exciting to really see a different push from the Africa bloc to really highlight where Africa is coming in with solutions. So I'm excited about the next couple of weeks.
Jean-Paul, over to you for looking
think,
forward.
Echoing a little bit what Jacqueline has said, that any intergovernmental process leads at the end where nobody gets 100% of what they ask. That's just the reality of any form of intergovernmental process. But for me, the biggest positive coming from Nairobi and also going towards COP28 is African ownership. I think Teresa expressed this extremely well, is that you have to build from your base constituency and from your societies and put forward solutions which are anchored within those societies. And I think what we saw at the Nairobi summit was a strong ownership of the narrative by African countries. Now, of course, there was also a lot of criticism from civil society, African civil society, that there was maybe a dilution of the aspects which are critical of the historical nature of climate change and the impact. I don't look at it that way personally, but I mean, people will look at it different ways. I think the ownership is very strong. And this issue of the historical aspect, which is also linked to colonialism, also as Teresa pointed out, because African economies are actually, in a way, structured still on that colonial model, focused on
the way the roads are, the way the
everything is designed a little bit from that for that purpose of taking resources out to feed a more developed economy elsewhere. And even the financing mechanisms actually reinforce that model. And what I saw coming out of Nairobi was saying that we want to find our own solutions anchored within our communities, focused as well on African companies investing within Africa. But certainly to get there, we're not going to do it on our own. We need technology transfer.
Partners.
We need catalytic finance. And yes, we do need support. And also there is this recognition of the historical injustice. And I think you can't divorce all of those aspects. They're all part of the solution.
Yeah, we started this discussion about climate injustice and justice, and I think it's core to the discussion and will continue to be when you have such imbalances globally. We could continue to talk, we will continue to talk in Dubai. The Africa Center will be very active in Dubai. We will be hosting events. We will be speaking with leaders there. So tune in to that. And we will be doing many of those things in partnership with the Global Energy Center. So it's my pleasure now to turn over to Landon Durrence, who's Senior Director of the Global Energy Center, to kind of talk about the plans of the Atlantic Council in Dubai and the outlook from the Global Energy Center. Landon.
Well, thank you, Aubrey. I really appreciate you coming together with the Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council for this timely conversation. Of course, COP28 is only a few weeks away, and I'm really appreciative for the panelists today talking about the imperative of deploying climate solutions, finding and identifying financing tools that can enable the transition, and of course overcome the perceptions of risk in Africa. Collectively, these actions can help us seize on opportunities in the context of COP, and I think even more broadly. As Das Volz called for earlier today, we need to be able to bolster economic opportunity and achieve our climate goals. COP28 is, of course, a platform that brings a diverse community together, a community that can catalyze action towards finding and identifying ways to our climate goals. That was certainly the case at COP27. So a year ago, it's my perception that the Global South was well represented and really brought an urgency to the climate change discussion for that community. We wrote in the Global Energy Agenda a year ago, and I'm just going to quote, however, that this cannot be climate action, and given the urgency of the climate challenge, cannot be left to diplomacy alone. That honest dialogue around the tangible impacts of climate change on impoverished communities throughout Africa, Latin America, and in the Asia-Pacific region should remain a fixture of the UNFCCC process, but that this discourse should not be only left to diplomacy, that it must be matched by equally impassioned efforts to deploy energy technologies that keep costs down, bolster political stability, and achieve international climate goals. And I think what we're hearing today is that when we come with nuanced approaches, the United States and African nations can leverage their partnerships to support deployment of technologies energy projects and low carbon energy solutions on the continent, accelerating certainly the energy transition there. But these partnerships can also galvanize climate and energy financing mechanisms across the continent. You know, in terms of our footprint at COP28, it's going to be robust. We're incredibly excited to bring the Global Energy Forum to COP28. We're excited to be working with the Africa Center, the Middle East Center, and others as we kind of collaborate on how to sustain and catalyze climate action in the context of the COP. So I appreciate the conversation today on Africa, on how to make change there in partnership with those of us in Washington, D.C. And I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists again for joining us, providing valuable insights on key priorities for the upcoming COP, and of course, have an opportunity to thank the audience here in person, as well as those joining us virtually around the world as we build momentum to make change in Dubai. Please note that these conversations are available for future viewing and can be found on the Atlantic Council webpage, as well as Twitter and YouTube. We hope to see everybody again at future Atlantic Council events with the African Center and with the Energy Center. Appreciate you making the time today and look forward to the next time. Thank you.